Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus and the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And for a while now, we've been on a journey talking about mental health. I hope you've enjoyed it. We've had some incredible people that we've interviewed. We've learned a lot. And today, Steve and I are going to wrap things up. We're going to conclude this series and reflect a little bit on what we've learned and our hopes for moving forward. Let's jump in. Steve, it's so good to be back with you, man. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and it's been a lot of fun working through this issue of mental health and wellness.
Dude, we've had so many just amazing interviews in the last couple of months, and so we're kind of wrapping up our series on mental health, and we're both pastors of a church. I do most of our church's teaching, and we're teaching through a series on mental health right now as well, and it's been so good just getting responses from people. And I think what it's really cemented more than anything is just how needed this conversation is today, that in our modern world, in different ways, all of us, we're wrestling with issues of mental health, whether we use that terminology or not. And so I've loved opening up the scriptures and diving into what God has to say about it.
Yeah, I've had that experience too. So many people, they may ask questions, they may agree or disagree with perspectives that have been aired, but everyone sees that this is a huge issue. Anxiety in particular seems to be the buzzword of the day.
Absolutely. So yeah, we've gotten a great response. Also, what has been cemented is that we are not all comfortable with this conversation. There is still a lot of fear around psychology and, mental health, and is this opposed to our faith? Does it go in line with our faith? Whatever. I got a funny comment from my message this last week. We brought up in our intro episode the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19, and this, the prophet who is in what I described as a mental health crisis. Everything he's hoped for, everything he's been working towards in his mind has fallen apart. No one's faithful. His work has amounted to nothing. He dismisses his servant. He walks out into the wilderness. He's alone. He's exhausted.
He's ready to end his life.
He's depressed. He begs God, take my life. I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And so we walked through the story in my message this last week, and I talked a lot about mental health and the different aspects of how we're created, of mind and body and spirit and all of this. And one of the comments I got was somebody who's just not comfortable with this conversation saying, why do we have to make these Bible passages be about mental health? Like, why can't we just preach the Bible for what it is, And it's not the first time I got a comment like that. I get a lot of comments like that. It was so funny about that comment of like, why can't we just preach the Bible is, in that message, I literally went verse by verse through this passage. 18 verses in 1 Kings. We read them all. We talked about it. But I think what it's revealing is there's so much we want there to be a dividing line. Like we want the Bible to be talking about quote unquote spiritual things. We should pray. We should trust God. Heaven and hell.
Right.
Eternity. Whatever. And we just get a little uncomfortable when the Bible crosses the boundaries into things like seeing a counselor, into things like taking care of your body. And, so I don't know. Have you experienced any of that as been walking through this?
Well, I just noticed that you really have to define your terms, and certain words are just lightning rods, right? So I wonder if you had in your sermon, rather than using the term mental health or mental wellness, just said, God is caring for Elijah's soul here, his whole person. I wonder if you could have avoided some of that just because it was such a stigma for that person to hear the word. For some people, I shared this in our first episode, the word psychology is just automatically conjuring up pictures of evil, people trying to brainwash us and go somewhere where God doesn't go. And yeah, there's a lot of trickiness just in the language.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. So, well, having learned nothing from my feedback, we're going to dive into this episode. And as we land this plane in this series, we want to come back to this overlapping, complex reality of who we are as human beings and how it affects our mental health. And in particular, the three parts of who we are, that we are mind, body, and spirit. And, that's why I was using this passage in 1 Kings, is because it's one of these places where God just so clearly, he ministers to all three of those aspects in the person of Elijah in the moment he's in. So, he's having this mental health crisis. He's asking God to take his life. The first thing that God does is tend to his body. He sends an angel who wakes up Elijah, and there's already bread cooking over the fire. He feeds him. He gives him a jug of water. He lets him drink. He tells him to go back to bed and sleep more. He sleeps again. He wakes him up again. He feeds him again. He gives him more to drink. He sleeps, so like, and so God very clearly is addressing some physical realities in Elijah's life first. Then God kind of puts on the hat of the therapist and basically tells Elijah, what's on your mind?
He goes full CBT.
Yeah, tell me what's going on. And Elijah does. He vents. He shares his whole narrative about how horrible everything is, and having done that, God gives him this spiritual encounter, this incredible revealing of God's presence, as we see, on the mountain, the wind, the fire, the earthquake, but God's not in those things. And then the whisper of God's voice, and God shows up there. And so you have this interplay of body, of mind, of spirit. And as we reflect on mental health today, I want to jump into that and really ask the question, okay, what are the problems we run into when we fail to see ourselves in that fullness of humanity? If we don't address our bodies, what are the problems that we encounter? If we don't address our mind, what's the problem? If we don't address our spiritual reality, what's the problem? And so yeah, I'm excited to get into that with you.
Can I say two things real quick too that just jump to mind as you bring this up? One is, since you're not going to do it, I'm going to give you a shameless plug here, because I thought that was one of your best messages. And if anybody's interested in it, you can go to our church website, alderwood.cc/messages, and listen to Wyatt's message from 1 Kings 19. But the other thing that comes to mind is, I think you're right. Since our first podcast, when we opened this series, I think maybe that's the thing that's crystallized the most for both of us as we've talked about it, these three categories of body, mind, and spirit. And I was reflecting on that with someone recently, and it hit me out of nowhere all of a sudden. I mean, think about the great commandment, right? And it's all through the Old Testament. Jesus underscores it in the New Testament. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, or body. Yeah. And I thought to myself, if that's what God created us for and what he wants most for us, is he not qualified, and would he not speak adequately to those issues in his word? So I think, I'm encouraged that we've kind of found these three categories. We didn't assemble anything new here, but they're so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump in. So we'll start with the first one. The first thing God does when he shows up in Elijah's life is tend to his body. And yet, how many sermons have you ever heard preached about your body, about things like eating, exercise, sleep? I mean, hardly ever. I've never really taught messages on that. And so what is the problem when we leave that out of our thoughts about our spiritual well-being, about our mental well-being? One of the things I'm remembering from our interviews when we had Dr. Greg Jantz on, which I thought was just an amazing conversation. He was talking about how he ministers to people through his inpatient facility, the center. And he said something that I wasn't expecting to hear, which was, one of the first things we're going to do when someone comes in the midst of a mental health crisis and a low moment is we're going to check their vitamin levels. and more often than not, we're going to give them an infusion of vitamins. We're going to do an IV vitamin infusion.
Didn't he say we're going to get them exercising too?
Exercise, yeah, all of that. And he was just pointing out that there is just this incredible link between how our vitamins are doing and our mental health. And I was surprised. I honestly, and probably because I'm naive in these areas, but I also, that feels like more like woo-woo, late night television commercial kind of stuff to me. And here, this renowned psychological expert is saying, no, like this is real. And as I thought more about that, there's just so many examples. I'm coming out of a season of life of the toddler, young kid era. My wife and I, our two kids are now getting to school age. And, it is so common for marriages to struggle in the early years of having kids. And, when you ask, like, why is that? Like, why do couples start fighting more? Why, do problems seem to arise that just weren't there before kids came? And there's all sorts of reasons why that's true. But a huge part of it is because no one's sleeping. Like that's, there's just this reality that if you don't sleep, your brain doesn't work very well, and your brain's pretty related to your spiritual life, and like your mental health and all of that. Like your body is just this real aspect of what's going on, and we can't ignore it.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I've heard people argue that modern Christians are like everyone else so influenced by the Enlightenment that we tend to go so quickly. It's not just a spiritual problem; it's a cultural issue for us. We think everything is just a matter of learning more, reading the right book. One of the interviews I enjoyed doing the most in our recent podcast was with Kelly Kapik, and his book that we referenced, You're Only Human, he really does a deep dive. I'd refer anybody to that book just on even the simple importance of everyday human touch. So, we read stuff in the New Testament about, greet one another with a holy kiss. And we're like, well, that's weird, But his point out of that was, okay, there might be some cultural issues there. Like we might not greet each other with a big kiss on the cheek or whatever, but even just a warm handshake or a hug on Sunday morning, or when you get together with your relatives or with a family member, like that stuff affects you in deep, deep ways. It's actually all over the scriptures, and I think Kelly did a better job than anyone I talked to about drawing that out.
Yeah, I love that conversation as well. I think before we move on, like where this body conversation really gets controversial in the space of mental health is around the question of, does medication play a role for some people in addressing mental health issues? And the church has wrestled with this for a long time. Certainly, the church has been more resistant to the use of mental health drugs than society as a whole. And I will say, I think there's good reason to be cautious in this area. I think over prescribing of mental health drugs is a real thing. I would really question someone who is getting prescribed drugs by like a general practitioner and not involving mental health professionals.
Which apparently is surprisingly easy these days.
I hope we're not like giving anybody any ideas here, but you can basically walk into your primary care doctor and say, I'm feeling anxious, and get medication prescribed in one visit.
I hear people say it quite often.
It's not a good idea. Don't do that. But there's reason to be cautious. But if you think that just categorically it's wrong, it's sinful to use medication to treat mental health, I think what that's revealing about you is that you don't think that the body is a real category in this conversation. And I would just challenge you. I don't think the scriptures support that view.
I absolutely don't either. I mean, the first question to that is just, if you have an infection, do you take penicillin? I mean, I realize that's a different thing in one sense because it's a physical, quote, physical problem. But we are clearly body, mind, and spirit beings. I have a story on this. Just recently, I was sharing this with you yesterday. A friend of mine who struggles with OCD has finally gotten on some medication, and she's a very committed believer, comes from a pretty conservative background in church, and felt guilty about it. But she has found incredible freedom since she's had this medication. She said what it's enabled her to do is not just feel good, it's enabled her to do the hard work of learning how to tackle her fears in a healthy, logical, constructive way. So, I mean, there's a lot of good there, but to ignore it seems to be ignoring a good gift God has given us.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Well, let's move on and talk about more issues of the mind. And this is, I think, a common tension in the church as well, where there's a tendency to turn everything into a spiritual problem, to not use the tools of modern psychology, to think that psychology is opposed to the scriptures, to faith. But what happens if we make that error? If we ignore the mind as a real category of human existence, what pitfalls do you think we fall into pretty rapidly in that case?
I go back to the story of Elijah, that you shared. And one of the things God does after he feeds him, but before he has the profound, hearing the still small voice, is he corrects his thinking. Yeah. Elijah's sitting there thinking, I'm the only one, there's nobody left. And God leads with, really? There's 7,000 other people in Israel who have not bowed the knee. So, biblically we see that it's important, and faulty thinking is something the Bible addresses as readily as does, I mentioned CBT earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy. does very much the same thing in the modern psychological world. So clearly it's a huge part of who we are and how we function.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard a number of people, and this is more common in hyper conservative circles, but I think this way of thinking seeps into more mainstream thinking at times. Just the simple phrase of like, well, psychology is not biblical. Or basically, and someone's, what they are actually talking about is there's some theory of Freud or whatever that they think is unbiblical, and they're just describing that with the banner term psychology, like
right.
The entire field.
Which incidentally means the study of the soul.
Well, exactly. Well, or the study of the mind, the study of the soul. I mean, those are synonymous in some ways. And it's like, really, like, do you want to completely give the study of the mind to the secular world? Like that that God has nothing to say about how we think, about our minds, it's just such a silly thing to think that whole field is outside the realm of Christian theology. Like, of course these things are related, and when you dig into a ton of what modern psychology is doing, you'll see all kinds of overlaps between what the scriptures are teaching and what psychology is trying to accomplish. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a great example of that, where the aim of cognitive behavioral therapy is to correct wrong thinking.
Right.
And there's some different avenues in which CBT will tackle different things, but a huge one is things like black and white thinking, where you're stuck in a trap of not seeing nuance in things, of not seeing gray areas, of not seeing something can be challenging but not the worst thing ever, that something can be good but not the best thing ever, some of those sorts of things. Catastrophizing, worst case scenario thinking, like a lot of that is what CBT is trying to tackle. And when you look at the scriptures, you're going to see God doing that all over the place. I mean, the most common command in the scriptures is do not be afraid. Is God stepping into a moment when human beings are catastrophizing, are thinking that something is horribly wrong, is never going to be fixed, and God saying, no, don't think that way. Don't be afraid. Everything's going to be okay. That is a CBT model, right there.
It shows up so many places in the Bible. I was thinking of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus doesn't just say, don't worry. He says, who of you by worrying can add a single day to your life?
Correct.
I mean, he reasons with us and he reframes issues. The Proverbs are nothing but correcting our thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a lot of psychology is, can you look at this from a different angle? Can you see a different perspective? And that's exactly what Jesus does. Okay, you're worried about your own life. Did you think about the birds? Did you think about the flowers of the field? Like, can you see outside of yourself that God is taking care of things? Can you imagine that might apply to you as well? In the story of Elijah, at the end, after the moment when God finally does correct Elijah's thinking, essentially what he says is, Elijah, you're just not seeing the full picture. You're catastrophizing. You're thinking that things are worse than they are. Elijah, you're not the only one left who's stayed faithful to me. There's 7,000 more. My plan hasn't been derailed. My plan is right on track, and you're going to be a part of it. So go help, take the next steps. So there's all this overlap.
One other thing I would say too, I think that some people might be uncomfortable with this, but I think psychology in some ways has really helped us see things in the scriptures we have missed. I could go really high level here. Freud talks about the unconscious. Well, the Bible talks all about the deceptiveness of sin and how we delude ourselves. In the Psalms, we see them encouraging us to talk to ourselves. There's almost different parts of us. You might even say id, ego, superego. There's things, family therapy. We look at the book of Genesis and we see generations affecting generations. So in some ways, psychology, I think, has opened us up to thinking and recognizing thought patterns that we weren't necessarily seeing before. It doesn't mean we embrace it a whole 100%, but I think it's helped us.
Yeah, I think that's a good word. I think the other thing I just point out is this should not be surprising to us. It should not be surprising that secular people, and Freud was an avowed atheist, not a Christian in any way, but it shouldn't be surprising that someone like Freud will support and teach true things that agree with the scriptures. And the reason why we shouldn't be surprised by that is because this world was created by the God who inspired the scriptures. We were created by the God who inspired the scriptures. And so all truth is God's truth.
Absolutely.
And someone who doesn't believe in God and who doesn't read the scriptures and believe in the scriptures is not going to be able to see the full picture, but they are going to be able to observe the true world that God created and observe true things about it. That shouldn't be shocking. You know, most Christians, when they walk into a doctor's office with some sort of physical ailment, don't interrogate their doctor about their religious beliefs.
I'm not looking for John 3:16 on the wall. I want to see.
It's because we know that you don't have to be a Christian to have studied the body and know how to treat the body. There's an overlap there to the mind. You don't have to be a Christian to be able to treat the mind. Although, and this is where I want to acknowledge, it's right to be cautious and to not just accept anything that the psychological field is putting out as true or as the right treatment. Like, there are real ways in which modern psychological treatment diverges from the scriptures. And as Christians, this is what we do. We test things. We compare what we're hearing in the world and what we're seeing to the truth of scripture. And where it lines up, we accept it. And where it doesn't, we reject it. And so, yeah, neither of us are saying accept every psychological treatment or theory or anything like that. And there's a lot that's worth throwing out today. You know, there's movements today of just the hyper individualism of all of life is about self-fulfillment and self-actualization and fulfilling your desires, where you never question whether your desire is healthy or good or right. It's just, you know, anyone who's keeping you back from getting what you want is a hindrance. And how do you get around it? Like, that's not helpful thinking. You know, I think one of the problems of psychology without spirituality, and we're going to get here next, of what happens when you leave out spirituality, is without God, you can analyze the mind, you can learn things, you can treat things, but you can never ask questions of why. You can never ask, okay, what is the purpose of life? And so let's go there, Steve. Like, if you accept the body's real and you accept that the mind is a real category, but if you leave out the spiritual, if you decide, you know, you don't need the scriptures, you don't need a pastor, you don't need to pray, like, you just need a really good therapist and maybe some medication and exercise and eating well or whatever, like, what are you going to miss when you think about your mental health?
Well, I'd go back to your story from 1 Kings 19 first. You know, that's where God lands the plane. I mean, he visits Elijah with not just a mystical experience of God's still small voice, but of a very profound reassurance of God's presence and Elijah being known by a God, a real person who sees and knows. I think what we miss is that ultimately we all end up back at a lot of the same questions of responsibility, questions of guilt and forgiveness, questions of, am I ultimately alone in the universe? You know, how satisfying is it to have a tremendously healthy body and even be profoundly psychologically well-adjusted, and yet realize when you wake up in the morning, I think there's no point to me doing any of this. There's no point to me ever pursuing anything. It's all meaningless. You know, you get back to Ecclesiastes, and I think it's hard to live with a sense of real overarching psychological health if you don't see purpose and person in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most profound human needs to be healthy is meaning, which is what you just brought up. And, you know, famously, Viktor Frankl wrote about this, and even just studying how people could survive the concentration camps and how people could actually, in strange ways, even thrive in the midst of concentration camps. And, you know, his whole thesis was, it's about meaning. Meaning can sustain you even in the midst of horrible circumstances. And this is where, if you only have psychology and you don't have God and you don't have anything that's addressing the spiritual reality of who you are, there is no meaning. Psychology can't give you that. You know, CBT can correct your wrong thinking, can, you know, keep you from catastrophizing, can, you know, help you focus on gratitude and all of that. But if really at the end of the day, we're all here for a brief moment, and then we die, and eventually, we consume all the resources on planet Earth, and Earth dies, and eventually, the sun burns out, and the universe is just a dark, empty place. Like, what's the point of anything?
Yeah, I think people end up in those places. I was doing a little deep dive on Freud, and I learned that near the end of his life, he made this statement: guilt is the most important problem we face in our civilization. And I learned he was actually raised by a Christian nanny, profoundly impacted by her. He had a Jewish father who regularly read him the scriptures. And so he had this sense that there was a moral framework to the universe. And as much as he tried to fight against it, he kept seeing in himself and in his patients, I keep circling back to this thing of guilt. I can't get rid of this thing called guilt. Right. And so these issues, they plague us.
And that's where, without spirituality, if you're struggling with guilt, the best psychology can offer you is essentially like, don't.
It's not helping you.
Like, forgive yourself, get over it. You can put yourself in the context of others. There's plenty of worse people than you. Like, you're pretty good. Stop feeling that way. Because essentially what psychology is, without spirituality, what psychology is saying is guilt is not real. Like, there isn't a true universal moral framework where you have actually sinned or fallen short, and therefore your guilt is actually justified. What psychology is saying is we've evolved to feel guilty because it's generally beneficial for society and reproduction of the human race and all of that. And unfortunately, like,
it gets in the way.
Yeah, you've kind of like over-evolved guilt, and so sucks to be you. And you should just try your best to chill out. I mean, that's at the end of the day, really what psychology can offer you to deal with guilt. You need spirituality to say, okay, no, actually, you're feeling guilty because you did sin, because God created you to live in righteousness and reflect his character. And there's something wrong when you rebel against him. You're feeling something real. And also, the beauty of the gospel is that God loves you enough that even though that's true, he took that on and he forgives you of your sin. That forgiveness is real also. Like, if guilt's not real, forgiveness isn't real. And so you need the spirituality to address those things. Interestingly, Freud also did a fair amount of work around meaning, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And he had to really struggle with that too, because he wrestled with the reality that we need meaning, we long for meaning, and yet in his own worldview, meaning doesn't exist. There is no universal cosmic meaning. And so the best Freud could do, and I'm going to butcher the quote a little bit, but basically what he said is work and love and work, there is nothing else.
Wow.
That's the best you got. Get a good job, find somebody to love. Like, there is no meaning beyond that in human life. And if you don't involve spiritual realities, that really is the best you got. There's nothing more than that.
Yeah, it's hard to get around sin, and I mean, we talked earlier about reframing or using a different sort of way to frame this issue, like for the guy you mentioned at the top who's uncomfortable with mental health in the Bible. Well, people are uncomfortable with words like sin and righteousness too, but while we're on quotes here, I ran across a great one recently from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the famous German dissident, who led the German church that protested the Nazi movement. And he said his father, by the way, was a psychologist. He said the most experienced psychologist or observer of human nature knows infinitely less of the human heart than the simplest Christian who lives beneath the cross. Because with my Christian brother, I can dare to be a sinner. The psychiatrist must first search my heart, and yet he never plumbs its ultimate depth. The Christian brother knows when I come to him, here is a sinner like myself who needs God's forgiveness.
That's good.
Right? And reality is a tough thing. Facts are stubborn things. We keep banging our head against these realities, even if we reach a certain level of psychological and physical health.
Yeah. Well, to close this section, I want to speak to the person who knows Jesus, like knows the spiritual is a real category, but has a hard time bringing that in to mental health. And I think I encounter this a lot as a pastor. And I think so often what's going on is we got really bad advice at a certain point in our life. You know, as a younger person, maybe you were struggling with anxiety, with depression for the first time, and what you got from the church, whoever this was, is some version of stop it, or some version of just believe harder, trust more, stop worrying, repent of your anxiety, don't see a psychologist, don't go get professional help. Like, that means something's wrong with you.
Certainly don't take medication.
This is a sin issue. And because of that, so many of us had some sort of swing away from handling our mental health in the church and with the scriptures and with a spiritual lens on. And I get it. I mean, I get that if you've gotten some spiritual malpractice kind of advice on this, that it's easier to just think in terms of your therapist and just think in terms of your body and medication, whatever.
If I could just summarize what I think you're saying, is the problem isn't that you were given spiritual answers when you had a psychological problem. The problem is you were given bad spiritual answers.
Correct. And I just want to anyone who's in that spot, I just want to invite you back. The scriptures can be mishandled, but also, if you know that God's real, if you know that God created you, mind, body, and spirit, if you know that God inspired the scriptures, then also would you realize the scriptures are going to speak powerfully to these things? Like, don't you want to hear from the person who designed the whole thing? And so, without guilt, without shame, without saying cut off every other aspect, like, I just want to encourage people to bring the totality of who they are to God, to let God speak to even our mental health struggles and every other aspect of how we're following him.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things there. I can't remember if I shared this story before, but I don't want to give the sense that it always just takes a quick Bible verse, because that's some bad spiritual practice that has happened in the past. But I think I've told you this story before, Wyatt. When I was in high school, I really struggled comparing myself to others. And I was on my knees. I was really following Jesus, and I'm a senior in high school, and I read a verse in Galatians chapter 6, and I swear it's like, how did this get in here? I've never heard anyone preach it. It says each one should test their own actions without comparing himself to someone else. Then he can take pride in himself. And I was just like, that's the best psychological advice I've ever received, And problems are deep, problems are complex, as we've said, but I'm with you on this one. I really want to encourage people. The Bible, it's a big book. If you have a physical copy, look how thick it is. God has given us a lot of anecdotes, stories, teaching that plumbs the depths of every aspect of the human heart. But also there is a rich tradition in the church of deep-seated, well-advised, wise counsel for people who are walking through all kinds of fear, doubt, depression. And don't ignore the resources we have in the church.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think where I'll leave people today is just the end of Elijah's story in 1 Kings 19. God treats his body, asks him what's on his mind, lets him vent, and God listens, and God gives him this spiritual encounter, and then Elijah's still venting, still complaining. His narrative hasn't really changed, and you finally get to God's correction, and in the midst of correcting his thinking, God also says something else to Elijah, which is essentially, okay, it's time to start getting back to work. It's time to take some steps, to take some actions.
I love that.
And in Elijah's life, it was some unique things that really don't apply to us. He's going to go anoint new kings and another prophet. But I think that reality of we need to talk about our problems. We need to reflect on our problems. Sometimes we need to just sleep and rest. And sometimes it takes a long time for us to get to the point where we even have the capability to take some steps. But eventually, you do need to take some steps to change things. And so if you're in the midst of a mental health crisis, if you're just in the midst of a long struggle in whatever way it is, my encouragement to you is, can you get there? Is it time to take some steps? And And would you commit to even doing that right now? And I don't know what those steps are. Maybe it's something around your body. Maybe it's taking care of yourself a little bit better. Maybe it is your mind, and it's getting someone who can help you process mentally what's going on. Maybe it's your spirit, and you need to get back into church. You need to get back into Christian community. You need to have the courage to spend some time in God's presence, and maybe even hiding from Him. But things typically don't change until we do something to change things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd really double down on that Christian community one. I think it was Dan Allender who said something to the effect when you were chatting with him that so many of our psychological issues would be solved if we were just in healthy community, and you can't find community that looks more beautiful than the church when it's being what it's supposed to be. Yeah. We often fall short, but don't focus and dwell on the people who have failed you in the past. God will provide and bring people. Above all, look for someone who can listen. Just listen. We Christians tend to be not real great at listening. We want to jump to the answer. Look for that person, pray for that person, and God will bring them.
It's a good word. Well, thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, we hope you have enjoyed and learned as much as we have from this series on mental health. I started in our opening episode for this series saying, I hope we are not naive exiles. This is tricky stuff. The Bible says the soul is a deep well, and a wise man draws it out. We've tried to share some of the wisdom of others, some of the things we've learned, and we hope it's been a real encouragement to you. Would you please continue to follow us on your favorite app, platform, write us a review, tell your friends about Native Exiles, and we will look forward to seeing you again next time on Native.